Hello, everyone. I'm Eli Lake of the Washington Times and a contributor to the New Republic, and I'm here today with Julian Sanchez of the Cato Institute. How are you today, Julian?
Pretty good, pretty good. It's a lovely, lovely day. So I
Beautiful.
figured, what better to do than be inside talking about intelligence oversight and war powers with Eli Lake.
There you go. Well, if you're looking for a fight,
Hmm.
maybe Gabe Schoenfeld should be here because I have a feeling that even though Julian and I come from uh, different lineages intellectually, I suppose, but we are probably, I think, in agreement on. We're about a year and a half into the Obama presidency, and I've written an article called The 914 Presidency. And you've certainly kind of followed this issue, and there's been a few others who've been worried. And it looks like Obama is committed to what some people have called the long war, which is a war that is all over the world with no geographic boundaries and against a terrorist group, in this case Al Qaeda, which it's very difficult to understand when it would be over. And we haven't done a good job of sort of the endpoints, and then all of the extraordinary powers that go along with that war, which range everything from the authority that has been asserted by Dennis Blair, the Director of National Intelligence, to kill American citizens who've joined Al Qaeda, to holding suspected terrorists without trial, to military commissions, uh, and to what has been called rendition, which is the snatching of individuals and bringing them to other countries or our own countries. All of which is envisioned under one resolution that was passed 3 days after 9/11, called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. And that has been, in
Hmm.
many ways, the most important law of the GWAT, or the Global War on Terror, since it was passed 9 years ago almost.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me about the AUMF was that it was, and I'm surprised I'm going to say this, but it was the fallback position that the lawyers at the Office of Legal Counsel sort of came up with after they kind of went through John Yu's, sort of Article 2 powers, let me do anything theory of presidential power in war. That was sort of rejected as
I mean, Article 3.
too broad. Um, Article 2.
Oh, Article 2?
Article 3 is the court.
Right, okay.
Right. Uh, and uh, uh, and so, so that was sort of thrown out, and they kind of cast it out for something more plausible. I mean, it is interesting looking back if you sort of review those sort of early opinions that John Yoo did, where he's sort of invoking Article 2 and just doesn't even bring up Youngstown Steel, which is the sort of the famous case that does the kind of three-part breakdown of how presidential powers work. The idea that there's the powers he has sort of acting alone, those he has with the support of Congress, and then the idea that his power is at the lowest ebb when he's acting contrary to the expressed will of Congress. And so there's a whole analysis that sort of needed to be done there that was totally skipped. And so that rationale got kind of pushed to the wayside, and what was substituted was frankly, I thought, a less plausible argument, which is that the AUMF had somehow implicitly, essentially, granted all these powers that it might not seem to have, like powers of domestic surveillance. So it was a very strange argument that got made, that even though FISA has an explicit section essentially providing that in the first 2 weeks after a declaration of war, the president will have essentially unrestricted wiretapping power in that very early period after the initiation of a war. The OLC read the AUMF as somehow creating an exemption to FISA. And if you're going to read any authorization for military hostilities as effectively carving a loophole in FISA, it's very hard to sort of suss out why there might possibly be a section in FISA that deals with, kind of immediate wartime authorities like that.
Well,
But yeah,
you're getting to the nub of the issue, and I'm not a lawyer, but let me just pose it like this: the difference, it seems, between Obama and pre 2006 or pre Jack Goldsmith of the OLC Bush
mhm.
is that the pre '06 Bush said, "We're at war, and I can do whatever I want," and the AUMF is what grants me because it says we're at war, therefore I can do whatever I want. And Obama says the source of my extraordinary powers is the AUMF.
Mm-hmm.
But I am only acting within the intentions of what Congress wants me to do. So when you have issues, for example, what we're grappling with now, which is the authority to kill U.S. citizens without a trial or any kind of oversight that I can imagine, who join Al-Qaeda, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the pre-06 Bush would say, yeah, because I can do whatever I want. We're at war. Read the Constitution, right? Whereas Obama would say, the AUMF envisions giving me this extraordinary power because, hey, we're at war. And I'm just saying, yeah, there's a distinction there. And lawyers have told me that's very important because, presumably Congress could come back and say, no, you can't do this. And then Obama's whole legal theory on this would say, okay, because we get our power from the resolution in Congress. But it's still like a really broad resolution, and it's still interpreted in such a way by, obviously, the Obama administration to give him extraordinary powers that, we would associate with Bush. Do you think is that a fair point? Am I missing something?
No, I think that's right. And I think
Right.
you brought up one aspect of the problem, which is I think the indeterminate sort of length of the war. I mean, I guess you never know when a war is going to end, but this one in particular, doesn't really involve massing, competing armies in the field. It's hard to say exactly when it's over, but it's also, I think, hard to say exactly who it's against. I mean, Al-Qaeda is not Germany in a couple ways, and one of them is that it's hard to say really. What does it mean to join Al-Qaeda? I mean, they don't. I guess they do have actually payrolls, but is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula Al-Qaeda? How much operational linkage do you really need to say, well, they're part of the same group as opposed to two semi-affiliated groups? I think we haven't really grappled with that. We toss around Al-Qaeda as the name of the enemy, but I don't know how many people acting under that aegis or identified as being part of that are, literally people who have sworn personal allegiance to Osama bin Laden.
I mean, I guess, right. I mean, that's one of the problems of defining what is Al-Qaeda. And then there's a deeper kind of structural national security problem, which is that bureaucracies have been created before 9/11, but even more so after 9/11, in the guise of surveillance and homeland security and so forth, under the assumption that the march of lethal technology has made it so that small networks can do the damage of nation states. And so I think we really have to be very careful because, at least bureaucratically on the secret side, there is now a massive bureaucracy in place to keep us safe from small groups of individuals. And, well, how do you prevent these extraordinary powers from becoming permanent? And you're right, Al-Qaeda, who is Al-Qaeda presents one problem. But then there's a deeper problem, which is that everybody who looks at terrorism realizes that these tactics, or that the prospect of a terror gang getting a hold of a chemical or biological agent, or God forbid, a nuke or a dirty bomb or something like that. I mean, these are not, Cheney-esque black propaganda. This is a reality. This is a problem that this is true. So how do you strike the balance? And I tried in my 9/14 presidency piece to propose one, to sort of look at what other people have said in the past about it, and that is to sunset those powers. But I mean, I guess, I don't know, I'd be interested in kind of hearing what your view is. I mean, is your view just, live with the risk?
My concern about sunsets, especially having watched the Patriot fight, is that not that they're entirely useless. I mean, we do get some debate each time around, but I feel like sunsets always feel as though they are, in a sense, licensing something more expansive, because you think, well, it's sunset, so we can go ahead and grant powers that we might feel certain qualms about, but we'll go ahead because we know, it's not permanent. And yet then when the time comes for the sun to set, it seems as though it always kind of creates this sense of panic. Oh my God, these powers we've been relying on are about to die out. And now it's not a question of, will we grant these extraordinary powers? It's a question of, well, we have all these operations underway that rely on the assumption that we can do X, Y, and Z. And so now, are you going to withdraw those powers and disrupt this sort of ongoing operation? And the answer is always going to be, I think, for sort of cautious politicians, no. The easiest thing is always to just kind of quietly act to preserve the status quo and not revisit the issue. And I think, if you look at the Patriot debate, what's really just absolutely stunning to me is that a couple weeks before this, before the vote to reauthorize for a year a couple of provisions of the Patriot Act that were expiring, we had the Inspector General come out with a report on the use of national security letters, or at least I guess they didn't actually use national security letters. Right. They used basically
my old editor
notes,
John Solomon wrote that story. Yes, it's a very good. It's a very absolutely like, whoa, what do you mean you've been doing all this and you didn't even follow the really loose laws that were on the books that allowed you to do it, and you just did it anyway? Like, you just decided, well, better safe than sorry. Right.
Yeah, and you look at it and you see this, they're getting information about thousands of people over the course of a couple of years. And there seems, if you look through that report, it seems very clear to me that they had to know something was wrong. Everything that they did, at FBI just reeks of people who understand they're doing something kind of shady and are doing everything they can to avoid any kind of accountability for it. I mean, there was an attempt by one supervisor to put in a database that said, okay, we're going to actually track all these requests so we know who asked for what, when, under what authority. And the people just basically, the agents and analysts essentially just refused to use it, which I think, just says to me they understood something wrong was happening and they didn't want to be monitored. And yet, this comes out and there's just no sign that politically it made any difference. So I worry that if a sunset means you can get reauthorization 2 weeks after a report that says that comes out, I think, well, then what? Like, when would you let it sunset? If you do nothing to change national security letter authority in the wake of that, when do you do it?
Well, I actually think I'm going to dispute you on two. Well, let me first of all say I share your issues with sunsets or temporary powers become permanent because oftentimes, it's politically very risky to say we're totally safe and we don't need these special powers anymore. And maybe what I'm proposing could be like during the Cold War, there was this concept of the peace dividend, which is that after we destroy the Soviet Union, then we can spend far less money on defense and I don't know, the Air Force will have a bake sale and we'll have massive appropriations for kindergarten and stuff like that. So that never ended up happening, and it was like this sort of thing to kind of keep, it was like this promise, this unfulfilled promise. Okay, so I understand the issue, and certainly, in my correspondence with other people who care about this, they've brought this up. So let me say that that's why I tried to put it into sort of that there are three things that need to happen, which is that you can't just have sunsets on their own because the people who control all of the data of the debate have a vested bureaucratic interest in seeing a kind of forever war. And that's not for me to say. I want to stress this. I'm somewhat sympathetic to the view that we probably need extraordinary powers against these threats. It's just to simply say that any time you have a bureaucracy, the education department is always never going to say we've solved the literacy problem. Well, the NSA is never going to say we don't need to, listen to everybody. It's just a matter of sort of where you sit is where you stand, and that's F.A. Hayek. I mean, that's a basic kind of principle of these modern governments. So that's the first thing. You need to have there's certain things that are necessarily secret for, functional statecraft, but you need to have far less secrecy so that people can make their own decisions, not just on the threat itself, which is extremely important to have an independent judgment of, but also on the scope of activities that the government is taking to protect us. And, I understand that we can't risk, if we were to say publicly and acknowledge publicly all the things that we're doing with the Pakistani government right now, then the Zardari government would fall probably, right? So there is a limit to that, but there is, I think we can do far more at having our government reason and having Congress demand a kind of public accounting of all of the stuff that the CIA and the intelligence community and our military and everybody else is doing to keep us safe. So that's A. And B, and this is where I think journalists can do a very good job, and they have done a good job, like myself, in that, it's really, that's the job of the fourth estate, is to tell us when the war is over. Because I don't trust the government to tell us when we're safe again. And finally, we also need more independent oversight. The interesting thing about your FBI example, Julian, is that this would have never happened had it not been for an independent inspector general, right? We would have never known about all these abuses.
That's true, yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the IG statute is the independent inspector general statute, which was a result of the last set of these kinds of reforms after Watergate, is an example of a statute that has brought some sort of independent accountability. Now, sadly, it's unclear whether we have that kind of thing when we get into the classified side of the intelligence community. And why don't you talk about this, because you did a very interesting podcast recently on this, and I would commend, I hope we link, the statement of administration policy that rejects most of the oversight that is being proposed for the intelligence community.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a huge problem, and we have...
Right.
Bruce Schneier likes to talk about security theater. They make you take your shoes off at the airport and, go through all this rigmarole that
right.
probably doesn't do that much good in security terms, but makes everyone feel safer. And I think we have, what much more pernicious kind of oversight theater in place now, where we have these mechanisms that obviously in some cases effectively provide oversight, as in the case of the IG report, but more often I think provide what looks like oversight, kind of makes you feel as though someone's keeping tabs on it, but is not that much of an effective check. I mean, I think if historians who study intelligence oversight basically find that there's sort of an alternation between patrolling and fire alarm models, in terms of congressional action here. And for the most part, they're on a fire alarm model. If something happens that is so outrageous that they must act, they start engaging in pretty close scrutiny. But as a rule, for political actors, the problem here is that it's really hard to take credit for actions you're taking to really keep close tabs on secret intelligence activities. So, the best case scenario is you hear something that worries you, and you pour a lot of sort of time and staff and energy into making sure, everything is above board. And then, if you're successful, you don't get to send out a press release explaining exactly what you did. So, that's in the case where you really kind of on the assumption you understand that there's a problem. Because the part of the issue, I think, is that a lot of these briefings, when they are, kind of going through the motions of oversight, involve a handful of senators coming in to a room where they can't take any notes or leave with any documents, or have any of the staff with them who actually have the training and expertise to understand what the law says and what the implications are of doing certain kinds of surveillance or doing certain kinds of covert activity. And so they end up, relying in essence on the people briefing them, which is not a good model, I think, for oversight. Even in the case of the IG, if you're talking about doing oversight of national security letters, they ended up, basically doing an analysis in the first case that was basically reliant on samples. They would kind of audit certain case files, and they ended up finding this sort of systematic problem. But the truth is, you can't oversee. I mean, if they're putting out 20,000 to 50,000 national security letters, and that's one intelligence tool, and they're doing this, 20 to 50,000 times a year, you can't really do effective oversight of that in any kind of up close way. And more generally, I think it gets very difficult. I think one of the things you mentioned is reporting requirements is pretty key. It's weird how spotty the reporting requirements are, and how inconsistent they are, and how kind of general level they are. I mean, they're these cases where they're supposed to give kind of 30,000 feet up view of some kind of raw number of wiretaps they're doing, let's say, but it's really not enough to understand, what is the nature of these, why are they being conducted? There's a lot more information that could be made public, I think, without jeopardizing operations in any way. And also,
right. I think you have to have it that it's oversight, declassification, and sunsetting have to be like a package deal. which is if you just have sunsetting without rigorous oversight and declassification, then you will get into this position where you're just, you're rubber stamping. And if you have, really good declassification, but no sunsetting opportunities, we don't have any of it really. I mean, to a certain degree, we don't really have that for the overall war powers, which was my idea, but or not just my idea, but others come up with it. But that you need all of that to sort of rein it in. I mean, I guess the alternative to the view that you should try to figure out, we should have some way of sort of renewing our consent for these extraordinary powers as the American people. The alternative would just be to say, no, this is all totally unconstitutional and you can't do it, right?
Right. Well, I think some of it probably is.
Right. No, I'm saying that, I see myself, first of all, I'm just a journalist in all this, so it's not like for me to come up with a policy recommendation, but I don't think it's going to be very realistic, or I can understand the argument against is for saying, okay, well, there's all these things that you're doing in the GWAT are unconstitutional. You can't do them because we still have this threat, and I think that the reality is that if there was another terrorist attack, if Abdul Muttalib had succeeded, I think that there would be a groundswell of political support for even more draconian measures, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the.
I think that's probably true. But I also think, so there's two things. Just I know Gene Healy had a piece in the Examiner recently that I think is, I fundamentally agree with, which is just that, just as a matter of perspective, I don't think we are more existentially threatened now than we were during the Cold War. I realize the threat is different, and there's the worry about, sort of potent weapons in the hands of relatively small groups. But just, sort of taking a broader historical view, I don't know that the threat, while it may require sort of specific tweaks to the kinds of powers that are necessary to deal with it, I don't know if its scale is vastly larger than what we've coped with historically. And also, I think it's important to kind of ask, well, not just, well, there's a big threat, so don't we need more powers, but rather look specifically and say, well, is it actually useful to be able to do this or that, or is it actually crippling if certain checks remain in place on certain kinds of activity? So, if you look at Abdul Muttalib is not a bad example here, I think, right? Like so many of the cases that we've looked at over time, it's really almost never been the case that an attack happens or an attack is foiled, and we hear them saying, "My God, this is out of left field. We had no idea. We don't even know who this guy is or where he came from or what's going on." It's always, "Oh God, we didn't connect the dots." It's almost always that there was information at hand, and that it wasn't combined or analyzed or synthesized in a useful way in time. So it's a question of, well, do we need more robust information gathering power, or do we need sort of structural change to make the analysis more fruitful? So I think.
But you would agree.
You're right.
Agree
there would be a demand.
The dots were, were obtained that were not connected by extraordinary surveillance often, and. If I'm worried about the ability of the government to find out everything about me, if I'm worried about protecting my privacy, you know what I'm saying? We're in a totally new era. Part of it's because of technology, but yes, right. You're right. It's always this analytical failure, but that doesn't really help me on the question of, I would like to prevent that attack, and I would also like to kind of know that maybe sometime down the line. We could at least re-debate it. I actually think I'm more pessimistic. Al-Qaeda is a terrible challenge. I think that ultimately the people who will defeat Al-Qaeda will be, the majority, hopefully, of Muslims who reject this very ascetic and, joyless death cult. But the broader problem of James Bond-like supervillains being able to kill lots of people in, advanced post-industrial societies is a real one. I definitely want the government to try to prevent those kinds of attacks, but I also care a lot about my personal liberty, and I care about the Constitution. And I guess the best I can hope for is that every few years, we can have an informed conversation about how much risk we're willing to tolerate versus how much freedom we're, or how limited we want the government's powers to be. And that's an imperfect solution, but that's as best as I think we've got.
Well, I think that certainly would be an improvement. I think it is sort of dispiriting to me to see the way the debate is it seems like almost collapsed after the...
I know, it's unbelievable. It's incredible. It's like Obama, St. Barack Obama is president, and nobody, I don't want to say that. You have been very good. Glenn Greenwald, listen, Glenn Greenwald, God bless him. That guy has not stopped, all right? He is just as critical of Obama as he was of Bush. So I don't want to, say that it's everybody, but certainly the Democratic Party does not care about this. Pat Leahy has not been nearly as aggressive on these issues as he was under Bush. Would you agree with that?
It does seem that way. He did. I know he's been pushing Obama to finally nominate some folks to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which is again one of the
I broke that story.
Sort of crucial components here. This is it's been sitting vacant since 2008.
Right. That's extraordinary. That's incredible too. Right. Like that's an example of exactly. There's bipartisan agreement that there's this extraordinary powers that we have now, and that we should have the government have some sort of institution within the executive branch that has access to all the classified information that can make sure that there aren't abuses. It's just like a common sense thing, and Obama can't even get around to doing that.
Yeah, I just you can say, well, there are other appointees that are getting blocked, but that he's not even hasn't even offered someone up. It seems like this is something that could probably get through some people in short order. But yeah, it does seem like after Bush, I guess that maybe because it's not part of his narrative that he's a scary, Orwellian figure of fear. It's actually weird to me that the sort of the Tea Parties haven't picked this up a little bit. If they think he's a Stalinist, it does seem like Stalin was famous for a number of things, like health reform's not really chief among them. It was that whole totalitarian surveillance state. So
trials of the Ansan regime is another one that he was famous for. On the Tea Party movement, I would think that there would be space if the Tea Parties are against statism and they're against big government and they're against government control of your everyday life, then they should be worried about these extraordinary powers, and they should not be so trusting that they will always be used for good. As we've seen on a number of occasions, mistakes are made. Now, the other thing I would just point out is that I also think that from the perspective of just the intelligence officer or the Americans that we ask to perform every day in the war against Al-Qaeda and international security, they deserve something better than what they have now, which is they do a bunch of stuff in secret, and then someone, in the press writes about it, and then then there's this huge, everybody gets their fainting couch, right, Julian? I also think that if we need to have this sort of validation as every few years to say, yes, we want you doing all these things, and then we won't act like we're shocked and horrified when we find out that you've done them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think there's always you see this tendency, right, where there are questions about how much the Gang of Eight who've been briefed about either the CIA activities or the NSA activities,
right,
knew or understood, and then in a way, part of the problem with the level of secrecy is that it provides a level of political cover later. So, so they can honestly, Jane Harmon at one point, I know, claims that she said she got briefed on the NSA wiretap program, but thought somehow it was part of FISA, didn't really understand that they were circumventing FISA until the New York Times wrote the story, and she got to talk to a lawyer about it. I think in a way, the intense secrecy creates a situation where when stuff is exposed, people who are privy to it get to go on the attack because they can, I think quite plausibly say, well, we were briefed, but this wasn't really, we didn't really understand.
Yeah, well, I've never been sympathetic, or, I'm somewhat skeptical of the, I never really understood it 4 years after the fact, but And the classic example is Nancy Pelosi claiming that she had never been told that there would be waterboarding, when it looks like that's pretty hard to believe. But I agree with you that the Gang of Eight is not the Gang of Eight is not an ideal sort of way to deal with that. But when you're talking about programs that are so sensitive that that if they were public, they would at that moment they would sabotage the result of the operation. I mean, I think that there is some latitude. What I think is less, what is more problematic is that you can't have. I don't want to see kind of massive government activities that are going on in terms of collecting information or sorting through or things to prevent attack that we don't find out about for years and years and years. There should be some sort of regular public accounting. And I guess, negotiating that is a difficult thing. I mean, one idea that people have talked about before 9/11 was that, generally there are, there's a I don't want to say handful, there's like, 2 or 3 dozen reporters in Washington who cover the intelligence community and the national security world. And as I'm one of those people, and, I guess you could say we certainly don't have clearances, but we get access to people that the regular public does not get access to. And that if there was some sort of regular understanding between the press that covered this world and then the sort of barons of the intelligence community about the kinds of things that the intelligence community feels that if were printed, and sometimes it can be stuff that's not like a front page headline, it could be like a detail in a story, versus, what I think my side of the reporters would say, well, can we have basically a public acknowledgement of the following kinds of things? That might be one way to do it too, without obviously either side relinquishing their important roles in that. But there is sometimes, I think it can be pretty reasonable with reporters. I've been asked at times not to report certain things, and usually if it's a good reason, I'm happy to comply.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, I think it would be a good start if they just started successfully making public the stuff they're already statutorily required to.
That would be good too, right?
For example, I know they're supposed to keep tabs on the number of federal pen registers. So for folks who own pen registers, it's basically it's a kind of wiretap light where they get the traffic information about sort of ingoing and outgoing phone calls and emails and internet traffic,
right?
But not the actual sort of contents of the communication. And so we're supposed to have an accounting annually of exactly how many of these they're doing. And it would be nice to have perhaps even more information about very, maybe broad categories of what the justification for the pen register was. And maybe, it's actually hard to know whether they're actually sending them in a timely manner to Congress. But I know there was a dump of statistics from a few years back, and then we had 4 or 5 years where there was no public whisper about this data. A friend of mine finally put in a FOIA and was able to get some of that information, and it showed actually a pretty massive spike in the use of pen registers, which is especially interesting in light of the way technology is changing, so that this stuff that used to just be something you could use to find out who your target was calling, can increasingly be used to figure out where your target is. Because you can get, part of the routing information is cell site and sector data, and we're getting essentially more and more precisely able to target location from the information your cell phone is broadcasting.
Right. Well, that technological wizardry can sometimes be used for great benefit. I mean, in Iraq, one of the things that turned the tide of the battle was that temporary cell phones were quickly been able to sort of picked up, and then we were able to find location of would-be suicide bombers and other nasty types. So, I mean, there.
Oh yeah, I don't think. I certainly don't think there should. I think there should be essentially no limits on the use of that technology in Iraq.
Right.
I don't have any kind of principle.
No, I agree with you. When it's in this country, and I guess, yeah, exactly. I guess, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you're right. That's an example of that. And then the other thing is that you keep hearing is that the intelligence committees themselves don't have the manpower to fully oversee a lot of it. So they asked for the GAO, for example, to have some more ability to get into intelligence programs. The CIA, I think, is opposed to that because they like to limit the loop of people who are, the CIA obviously and the intelligence community, they are built on secrecy. They don't want information coming out. They're constantly worried about what other intelligence services know about how we do our business and so forth. So there's, to a degree, I think there is a sense that they don't like to sort of broaden out the circle of people who do oversight on them, and it's a pain in the neck for them. So I kind of understand that. But at the same time, the old joke about the intelligence committees on the Hill was they're like mushrooms. You feed them shit and keep it in the dark. So, I mean, I think that, and there was this period of under Bush where, at least I remember, a lot of people, I mean, the real civil libertarians are still very concerned about all of this, but there was more of a political push to have better oversight, because it was seen that, like, where were the intelligence communities when all these things were going on, and they were often finding, like, kind of in a reaction mode, and they weren't, kind of keeping tabs while all this stuff was happening. And
it reminds me, I just wanted to interject, because I don't know if you saw this, I wrote something about it, but it's the most extraordinary, to my mind, sort of story about the bizarre effect of these oversight committees, is that when they renewed the Patriot Act in 2006, they changed the language surrounding 215 orders. This is 215 orders are orders that can be used to get any tangible thing from a third party. So, business records, but also potentially, your blood samples or DNA from a medical office, essentially anything they want. And so they decided they were going to ramp up protections for certain categories of records: medical records, library records, education records. And so they sort of pass an amendment that sort of requires a little bit more review at a little bit higher level when they're going after these kinds of records. What they didn't realize was that the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department had looked at the language of the statute and said, well, it doesn't say notwithstanding any other law here. And there are already other statutes that protect education records, medical records. And so I guess they assumed that they were subject to the more stringent protections of those other federal statutes. Then Congress, thinking it is stepping up protections, passes this amendment, and then the lawyers look at it, and we know this sort of after the fact from again, Inspector General reports, and they say, well, since they're explicitly mentioning these types of records with this kind of procedure now, I guess the 215 section trumps all those other federal privacy statutes, so we can follow this protocol and not the more restrictive protocols in those other statutes. And just from kind of talking to people, it's pretty clear that that was not what Congress intended. They thought,
Julian, it's interesting you bring that up, because this is a classic example of how the Obama lawyers' sort of explanation for how they're different in wartime authorities is so problematic when you get, the rubber hits the road, because there are so many conflicting statutes, right? That when you pick and choose which ones you think you're following, right? I mean, the notion that, like, Congress lets us do this because of the AUMF, as opposed to my war powers as president lets me do this. And now we're at war because of it. I mean, it's almost like, well, yeah, that's a perfect example of, well, there's other laws that protect these records, but then there's some laws that says we can do it, so we're just going to pick the laws we like, right?
Yeah. I almost, not quite, but almost preferred the Bush approach, where, you would challenge his wiretapping program or his rendition or his waterboarding, and you would at least get an open argument. You would say, I think I have the power to do this because of X, Y, and Z, and it's really important, and so, and tough. I got in an argument with a very well-known reporter on this. Not an argument, but we just sort of going back and forth on this, right? And I don't want to say because it was a private conversation, but I guess settle this mystery for me. I don't understand. Like, the Bush said it's my war powers, but like Obama says the AUMF gives us all these extraordinary powers. I mean, is that a distinction with a difference? I mean, I don't know. Well, I mean, Bush actually used the AUMF argument too. So I mean, after Comey and Goldsmith sort of had their moment of revolt, they flipped from the inherent authority to the AUMF argument. Does it matter? Well, in theory, at least with the AUMF, he's acknowledging that Congress could change the rules. So for example, when they passed the FISA Amendments Act in 2008, essentially legalizing with some sort of fig leaf of judicial oversight the initial warrantless wiretapping program, they included, and at the time I didn't understand what they were doing, and then it occurred to me later, they included language saying, again, FISA is the exclusive means for electronic surveillance. And I thought, well, why does that matter? Because it already said in FISA that it was the exclusive means. Why do they say it again? I mean, he's going to listen to you now that you said it again. But it occurred to me, wait, if the argument now is the AUMF, so implicitly the AUMF created an exemption, then if Congress later than that passes a statute saying, no, it really is the exclusive means, they're essentially saying this trumps the AUMF. So it does at least acknowledge that if Congress says these are the limits, if your argument is that you're acting on statutory
and I totally acknowledge in that respect, Obama would in some theoretical situation where Congress would say, no, you can't do this. Mm-hmm. He would have to by his own argument, right? But then you just presented this issue where Congress has dozens of laws, right? And depending on how you want to interpret it, which is why there is such a species of thing called a person called a government lawyer, that you can find, various parts of statutes that would appear to limit, what you could do, and that it seems that at least on very important questions of the Obama administration, they have decided to go with a more muscular version of what the AMF grants them. And their argument is that, did you see this Harold Coe speech from last month about kind of what they're doing? And Harold Coe is very satisfied with himself. He's, by the way, just for the State Department's general counsel, their legal advisor, and former Yale law professor, and a former critic of Bush's conception of war powers. Mm-hmm. And at one point he says, well, the international laws of war are such that sometimes we have to analogize what it would mean in the context of fighting a global terrorist network. Isn't that exactly what the Bush administration was doing that was so horrible at the time? Right?
I think that's
they were analogizing what they thought Geneva would mean in this context.
Yeah. And it is a real problem in some respects. I think in a way we are suffer from a sort of paucity of useful metaphors. We have this sort of we have this back and forth because, well, no, you can't try him in a civilian court because we're at war, as though that somehow was in itself as like a self-contained answer to sort of the puzzle of what the right mechanism is. The truth is, right, we're engaged in a conflict that is in many ways more like war than like some kind of criminal enforcement, but in many ways is not a whole lot like a war. It's in some way the battlefield is
the world.
The world, right? There are no clearly defined borders. To some extent, the kind of the key activity is in our own borders, but not in our own borders in some identifiable kind of landing site of an invasion.
And also increasingly really the internet, yeah.
Yeah. And so I do think there's in a sense a problem of deciding that we're either going to, sort of in this enormous global battlefield, treat all aspects of it either as though it's, you're going after like a drug dealer, or as if, the Soviet infantry has just landed on, the Florida Panhandle.
I think Doug Feith in my big piece for Reason explains the difference as follows: that he says that both models are inadequate, but his point is that the reason that the Bushies went with war was because they want to prevent terrorism, and there was never that kind of so the idea that we need to prevent these attacks, you can't have to be right 100% of the time. That still seems like a viable, or rather, if you were to put that to a vote and you say, do you want the government to prevent terrorist attacks? I think you'd get pretty strong majorities saying yes. And I guess my point is that there's a consequence to wanting the government to prevent terrorist attacks, which is which is this real danger of a kind of permanent war and a permanent war authorities, right? Yeah, I guess what? I'll say this because I would like to see someone make the case against that. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't want the government to prevent terrorism because the risk to my personal liberty is too great for them to do all of that. I mean,
well,
you know
I think there are certainly people, John Mueller and others, who have certainly argued that we are devoting too much, essentially, sort of panic resource to the prevention of terror. I mean, it's not that I don't think we should be attempting to prevent terror attacks so much as I do think, if we sort of step. I mean, so you can say on the one hand, you can say, look, powers and mechanisms that we would not countenance for hunting down a drug dealer might be appropriate for the activities against Al Qaeda, and then talk about where exactly on the sort of spectrum you want to sort of drop the marker. I do think it's certainly fair to say, or I would make the case to be sure that our demand for more authority is out of proportion to both the real extent of the risk of terror relative to other kinds of crime that we seem able to live with, and also that we have not been that good at looking closely and saying, well, look, what is the actual return on the more extraordinary powers? I mean, sort of the more extraordinary the authority is, the more I'd like to see some kind of actual, and maybe I can't see the evidence, but the more I'd like to at least know that there is some kind of serious metric where you're going, well, what is the marginal gain we're getting out of this tool?
There were times when Bush would give speeches. I think he gave a speech in 2006 where he talked about all the terrorist attacks that he's prevented.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to remember all of them off the top of my head, but one of them would be the transatlantic plot of 2006. Remember that? Mm-hmm. When in London. I mean, there's been a couple of these. I mean, you can kind of more than a couple. The subway plot for New York, and sometimes it's hard to determine the difference between the feverish desires of some group of nutballs and then like a serious plot that would have that was advanced, and that's always going to be debated. But I think that every now and again the Bush administration did talk about the plots that were disrupted.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One is that in a lot of those cases, I think the Lackawanna Six are a big one. I mean, I remember having a debate with someone from Heritage who said, raised the specter of the Lackawanna Six, but we prevented another 9/11. And if you look at that case, I mean, these are obviously guys who did go to Afghanistan and train. And they were, they probably deserve punishment. But I mean, just the idea that they were on the verge of doing some kind of, I mean, it's not even clear that they had any kind of active plot at all. It seems like they'd gone over there and kind of realized they were in over their heads, and it didn't seem to have anything especially destructive underway. So one of the
relatives of the Lackawanna Six was killed in one of the attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Yemen. I think. Well, there was the one. Like there was the one cousin or something like that. So
there was the one of them who did stay over. So they went out to sort of check it out and think they were going to be awesome jihadis. And basically a bunch of them said "whoa" and came home, and one of them did stay over. And glad he's dead. But the other thing is the question of how are these cases broken? I mean, when they went back and did the IG sort of survey of at least in the declassified version of the NSA wiretap program, they say, well, it was a tool in the toolbox. We think it was probably useful, but when you kind of got down to saying, but can you point to a success where you say we broke this open because of this program and we don't think we would have gotten it otherwise. It turned out they couldn't find too much of that. And so I do think if you're doing something on this scale that is on face illegal, and you can't really point to something where we had a crucial success that we would not have had without this. It seems kind of useful. I don't want stuff on this scale being done because it seems kind of useful. I would like it to be the case that extraordinary powers are enabled when there's really extraordinary need, and not just when it seems like we're all panicked, we want to do something, and something is, we'll just go further and further without any real, attempt to measure whether this is what is getting the job done. It looks like human intelligence, much more traditional tools, are the ones that are cited when you look at actual intelligence successes. And maybe that's because they don't want to talk about their fancy secret programs. But
I guess, from my perspective, I'd like if we find out that, from the pocket litter of some Al Qaeda bad guy in Pakistan, that he's got some U.S. numbers in some numbers in the States, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then I would hope that there would be a very speedy legal process for finding out who the people this guy was calling in the States are calling themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see any particular reason why that can't be done through a FISA court. I'm just saying I would like the government to connect to connect all those and the people they're calling and the people that, what I'm saying? Like I want to, and at a certain point, where does the probable cause, how do you have probable cause and depending on how you interpret it, that gets a little sticky. But I do think that that's an example of wanting to look. And the other thing I would say is that, at least I've been told, but then again, I've been told by people in the intelligence community, but not, haven't seen the proof of, that the algorithms that are used for searching various patterns in terms of who you contact and emails and things like that can be useful in putting together potential folks to look at. But then at what point does the FISA process become so degraded that you're basically saying that an algorithm I have is I'm submitting for probable cause for a warrant, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's a huge problem, and my biggest, in a way, beef with the way this has all been handled is that we have continued to kind of debate oversight as though we were talking about kind of traditional oversight over, the sort of familiar individually targeted subject-based surveillance. We've got a guy, we're going to, put an alligator clip on the copper wire coming out of this guy's house, and someone's going to record all his conversations. And it's just obviously not how it works anymore, but we're trying to shoehorn this very technologically sophisticated forms of surveillance into a framework built for something completely different. And I think you break the framework and you don't get effective oversight. So it's sort of the worst of both worlds.
Right. This brings us finally. There's just two more points I'd like to kind of get before we end the dialogue. Mm-hmm. One point is there had been some. I think our mutual friend Chris Hayes of The Nation had written a piece last year saying maybe it's time to bring back a church committee. Church committee, to which, that's one way to do it, but that's a very hostile approach. And I just my issue with that kind of thing, and to sort of call people and before sort of to raise their hand and take the oath before a committee, is that it builds this idea that these people who I believe that the people working in the secret side of the government trying to make us safer are, they're not. I don't think they're nefarious people. I don't think that they're villains. I think that they deserve as much as we deserve, the people, is to sort of just to have an understanding of what we want them to do, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously, when they exceed their authority, we don't want it. But I think that in this, my issue is that I think we wanted after 9/11 an AUMF that was this broad. I think we wanted, to take the gloves off and all the euphemisms that Cheney used in that famous Meet the Press. You follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And that we only discovered a little bit later that we're kind of uncomfortable with it, and then it becomes very easy to say that, oh my God, the national security state that's created by Bush and Cheney, oh, they're so evil. But in fact, we should be real with ourselves about this, and we should say, yeah, to a certain extent after 9/11, and we felt like, we weren't doing enough, we needed to do more, and here's what we did. And then the courts obviously reined it in. So I'm much more interested in having that honest kind of political moment where we come to terms with it. And the other thing I would say is that the reforms of the 70s produced the FISA court. So we are capable of having independent oversight and having some checks on extraordinary powers. And so it's not like a hopeless concept, right? It's not like, oh my God, how are we ever going to do it, right?
I think that's right, although I do think it again, because of the technological sophistication of some of these searches, we do need to, I don't think in a sense, maybe the FISA court isn't enough anymore. I'm sort of working on a paper on sort of playing out some of these ideas, but I think it may be necessary at this point to actually have an Article III body that is specifically a group of technologists who can actually look at the code. If what you're doing is a search based on an algorithm that has a certain
Right.
kind of hit rate and that may change over time, saying, well, what's your probable cause? We're going to issue a warrant and sign off. In a way, doesn't make sense anymore. You need to essentially have coders and statisticians who can look at the code and really understand this is how the search works, and it is or it isn't probable cause, and what kind of return are you getting, and maybe it looked like probable cause, but it turns out this is not generating the kind of your ratio of innocent interceptions to actual meat is not enough to justify the continuing presumption that this algorithm embeds a probable cause standard. I mean, this is a sort of
I can't wait to read that.
Fantasy.
That totally seems like that's a very smart idea. And other people have talked about. I mean, listen, in light of the information about Anwar al-Awlaki, the world will be a better place, I think, when that guy is capped. But the questions it raises about the president's wartime authorities, maybe there needs to be, I don't know, an assassination warrant or some sort of court oversight for when citizens are going to be targeted. I mean, I don't know. I'm saying, or
so I'm just thinking of the idea of an assassination. Just the you have to admit that it is a phrase that does not roll off the tongue without generating a chill.
Well, what else is happening?
No, you're right.
We said as cruise missile where we think al-Awlaki is. What are we trying to just warn him? Is that a warning shot? No.
I know, but of course you're right that well, at any rate, I think if the idea is, well, we can we can kill an American citizen overseas in a country we're not actually actively at war with, on the basis of his membership in some group. I mean, it is a problem of if an American citizen joined the SS or whatever and is on the field in a Nazi uniform, there's just no question. It doesn't really arise. Well, can you?
And when we caught Nazi spies in Long Island, I think we assassinated them in World War II. There is this precedent for treating Al Qaeda like enemy spies, right?
Mm-hmm. If you're thinking of Quirin, were you thinking of the saboteurs we put on trial in military commissions?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. It was a military. It wasn't. We put him on trial in military commission. We did not summarily, but I'm just there is that's a good point. But there is this concept maybe that some people sort of talk about sometimes of a national security court system, which is similar to what I guess they have in Spain and Europe, and maybe that's.
I think Neil Cato, who was one of the people who was smeared as part of the so-called Al Qaeda 9, I guess it was, is one of the people who's floated this idea. And maybe that's the way it's got to go. I mean, I do think certainly right. If you've got someone who's like a cleric in Yemen or some of these guys who ended up pulled off the streets in Kosovo or something, you do get into a kind of a sort of circularity question here, where it's well, no, the president has the authority to sort of just order their death because they're a member of this enemy group, but because of Al Qaeda, I mean, do they have a membership card? What's the evidence? Is there reason to think this American citizen is actually an enemy?
Right,
and
that's
not,
the issue.
Yeah.
Right. By the way, al-Awlaki is openly saying he's a member of Al Qaeda, but that's not the point. The point is that you don't want to create a situation where the president can just determine that you've joined Al Qaeda and kill you.
Right. So the fact that there isn't that much question about this guy, I think, doesn't really solve the question. What should the process in general for people be?
Right. And by the way, if I could say something to conservatives, which is that by asking these kinds of questions about presidential authority, it does not in any way infer that you're soft on trying to kill Al Qaeda. It shouldn't. Those two things should not be. One does not flow from the other.
I certainly agree with that. Yeah.
Right.
It would be nice to see some more structure in place. I mean, almost the more disturbing thing, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that Bush at least kind of would make an argument and assert his powers. And it seems like even more aggressively than Bush, maybe, Obama's lawyers have used the assertion of the state secrets privilege in context where it's really not plausible. I mean, the idea that there are entire cases that cannot proceed at all, cannot be discussed at all, no classified information can be made available to a judge in camera.
Yeah, they threatened to limit intelligence cooperation with the United Kingdom if these 7 paragraphs about Binyam Mohammed were released in a court process. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's amazing. Anyway,
and so it means in a way they almost get to avoid. I mean, in the wiretapping decision that came down against them in this Al Haramain case, they finally said yes, this program violated FISA, and they sort of lost all these attempts to assert the state secrets privilege. I think probably they're just not going to, I mean, they may raise the state secrets challenge again, but I don't think they're actually going to get into litigating the underlying, well, is there presidential power to do this anyway, even though it was contrary to FISA? And that's, in a way, almost more disturbing because it says, look, we can use secrecy. Even when we lose, we can just sort of pay out the damages and keep going and never have to face an adverse decision on this. I mean, so at least, if you look back to the Bush era, Hamdi and the other case, the name of which is escaping me, but I mean, actually this stuff went to the Supreme Court and we actually got a judicial ruling on whether he had overreached the scope of legitimate presidential authority, and the answer was yes. In some cases he had. And I worry that secrecy will just avoid ever having to sort of face squarely the questions that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Right. And well, that's why I think, when the secrecy issue is totally linked to all these questions as well. And also it's the concept of this war against, an organization like this, which I don't know when that ends, and Obama doesn't know when it ends. And Obama, listen, there are certain things that Obama certainly has done. The executive order codified, I guess, the decisions of Goldsmith that the EIT program was no longer going to be used. And I suppose that that's a good thing. But, I've raised this question since the beginning of the Obama presidency, which is, if the CIA is going to be out of the interrogation business, but you continue to use other intelligence services, then, how is that endpoint any better?
Right.
I mean, by the way, and that's the thing, is that if you really want to know where the secrecy comes in for the Obama administration, they protect any secret that would implicate an allied intelligence service. So what you end up having is what kind of return to the Clinton years and before that, which is the reliance on allied intelligence services to do the kinds of things that we ourselves can say we don't do, and therefore, right. You get around it, but you haven't. It's still. This is
the Five Eyes shell game, where we've got under the UK-USA treaty, we have a certain sort of bilateral pentalateral obligations to essentially a bunch of Anglophone nations where we share intelligence in a way that, essentially, I think can provide a loophole around.
It's not. Well, that's surveillance. I'm talking about rendition.
Oh, yes.
We have counterterrorism agreements with Morocco and Egypt and Pakistan and all these other countries where, we catch a bad guy. Of course we're not going to send him back. The CIA is out of that business, right? So where does he go? It probably in many cases just another country's intelligence service. And if you get into details, I've asked. There are plenty of opportunities. Obama could have said, "We'll never rendition somebody to a country that is known to torture people." That would have been a simple way to avoid the problem, right? Mm-hmm. They have not done that.
And I guess and
they're going to get more. They're going to get an official statement saying this guy wasn't tortured. There'll be monitors and visits and stuff like that. And we'll see how it works. I'm inclined to wait and see. My report card. 15 months into the Obama administration is that on the key question of war powers, they're very, very, very similar to Bush.
Yep, and I think you pointed out rightly that the conservative assault on his newly, I guess, criminal or soft approach to terrorism is bizarre, given how assiduously he has fought to keep and, if not expand, so many of the Bush powers and so many of the Bush programs. It does look like a strange kind of kabuki a lot of the time.
Well, but I think that the Obama administration totally plays along with it. They would love to be attacked for being too soft because they have an issue with their base politically, which is that, so they love to say, you're playing into Al-Qaeda's hands by saying our courts aren't strong enough to handle terrorism. Well, okay. I mean, John Brennan, the guy who wrote that op-ed. Do you remember this op-ed from a few months ago?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Okay, this is the guy who writes this op-ed, who is working in an administration that is, has this very broad view that's doing drone strikes, in various countries, and is targeting Al-Awlaki and on and on and on it goes. So I think that that both sides are willingly trying to participate in what is largely a kind of fake debate, which is that it's like, oh, we're soft and and you're. And that there's this big distinction when there's in fact much more continuity.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is a weird display to watch played out when you sort of are paying close enough attention to realize how absurdly slim the sort of substantive differences are underneath. But in honor of the desire for engagements that do not sprawl out of control under ill-defined terms indefinitely, perhaps we should wrap there and just.
Yeah, no, I like it. I like that. It was great doing this with you. Thanks a lot, Julian. And you'll see us on the internet soon.
Hasta
That doesn't make any sense. All right.
Well,
okay.
the NSA is listening.
Yes. All right.
They'll see.